Well, Melbourne detectives are investigating the death of the Men at Work flautist and saxophonist Greg Ham. The 58-year-old's body was found at his house in North Carlton yesterday. The music commentator Glenn A. Baker joins us now from Sydney. Good morning to you, Glenn Baker. Thanks very much for your time.
And good morning to you.
What are your memories of Greg Ham as a person and a musician?
Bright, bouncing, ebullient, and very central, I think, to the presentation of Men at Work. You've got to remember that they arrived as this band that had been discovered in the Cricketers Arms Hotel in Richmond in Melbourne, and word of mouth grew and grew and grew, and by the time they were signed to a recording contract, people were absolutely intrigued by these guys, particularly by the fact, well, the lead singer was like cross-eyed and had that going for him, but the second guy, Greg Ham, played the flute, played saxophone, played keyboards. He was beaming, he's smiling. He just had a sort of, a zest about him that really did add to that whole persona of the band. And what was very useful about that is that they arrived in America at the time that MTV was basically getting on its feet. And suddenly they were the band that had the right look for something like MTV. So 300 million Americans fell in love with them as well as Australians. I remember as a rock journalist, when they come back from their incredible feats overseas, that Greg was the one I would go to for interviews and just to get comments and quotes from him, because he was just up and he was just observant and he was just good fun to be around. So what I remember of him is just a charming and very, very pleasant and enjoyable man to know.
What do you know about the state of mind that he was in the last few years? He obviously took the court decision in 2010 very hard.
I suppose when you're accused of plagiarism, and this is certainly not the only occasion of this, it cuts to the core of who you are when you are a creative person, when you are a musician, particularly when, I suppose, the riffs on a couple of songs is really the main focus upon you. And when somebody says, well, you stole one of those, or even if it was subconscious plagiarism, as was once the case with George Harrison, I think it doesn't sit well with you. I think that it becomes something that very likely gnaws away at you. And I mean, that was his legacy. His legacy was Who Can It Be Now, Down Under, a couple of other hits, but it was that band at that time in the early 80s. And it's worth noting, by the way, that that how successful Men at Work were. I mean, INXS once used to say that nobody in Australia knew how big they were overseas. Well, certainly no one in Australia really ever understood what Men at Work had achieved. I mean, their first album broke the Monkees record for number of weeks at #1 for a debut album on Billboard. I think it notched up 16 weeks. Then that incredible feat of being simultaneously #1 album and single charts, England and America. That's something that normally was done by Rod Stewart or Barbara Streisand or something. I mean, their achievements were pretty phenomenal. It was a short-lived thing, but it was incredibly intense. And then the Australia's Cup sort of situation with Down Under sent it back up the charts, and it really did become a quasi-national anthem. I mean, it was a song that Australians would just sort of like chant and yell out to themselves. It's a bit like Icehouse's Great Southern Land. It was one of those songs that we felt very, very close to.
Colin Hay has paid a wonderful tribute to Greg Ham. How do you think he'll be remembered?
Oh, I think he'll be. I mean, I think from what I recall of Colin's thing, he said he just has the most wonderful memories of just the great times with him, because he was a funny man, and he was a funny, bright, cheery guy. I mean, he would tell me stories about the American obsession with fame that would have me rollicking around. I mean, he thought, as Australians who were fairly solid, don't get really carried away by the trappings of fame, he thought it was often quite hilarious what went on in America and the way they took to them. But I think that, like Colin, we'll remember him as a great musician. I mean, he was multi-talented. He was really integral to the sound of Men at Work, and he was, like I said, just a good Aussie bloke. I mean, in the end, that's the greatest compliment I think we can pay to him. And I suppose that there were personal demons he had to overcome. I suppose that's not uncommon with people who've known huge success and then have to come out the other side of it. But we've lost one of our good guys. There's no question about that at all.
Glenn Baker, I'm sure many Australians will agree with you on that. As well, in the United States, we've got the news overnight of Levon Helm from the band passing away. How big a loss is that to music?
That is an enormous loss. At the end of the 60s, the band really defined their time. They brought an earthiness, almost a rustic quality to rock music. It was the sound of ages. The group had 3 fine singers in it, a great songwriter, but with Levon Helm, the man from down south with all those Canadian boys, they had a voice that could somehow get into your spine. And when you go back now and you hear, you know, The Weight, Rolled into Nazareth, Feeling About Half Past Dead, you really do shiver. He was one of the greatest rock vocalists of all time. And it's just a voice you will never forget. It's an enormous loss, but not unexpected, because, you know, he'd been struggling with throat cancer for quite some time. He even made an album after he was diagnosed and had supposedly recovered, and we were all sort of rallying for him and hoping that he had got past it. But the loss, well, there's now 3 members of the band are gone. We've lost Richard Manuel and Rick Danko as well, and but with Levon Helm, that's something that it really should make anyone who loves quality rock music will have cause for pause over this news.
Glenn Baker, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us this morning.
Okay.